Boomerangs, bombs, dungeons, magic swords, puzzles, and green tunics. Welcome to The Legend of Zelda. With 20 years of hit titles under its belt, the Legend of Zelda franchise has earned its right to be one of the most popular, influential, and critically acclaimed entities in all of video games. Selling over 47 million units, its familiar characters have become some of Nintendo's biggest icons. Created by Shigeru Miyamoto and inspired by his childhood, wandering the nearby forests of his hometown Kyoto, The Legend of Zelda made its debut in 1987 on the Nintendo Entertainment System. 8-bit gamers were introduced to the young Link, a quiet boy in a green tunic who set out on what would become a never-ending quest to rescue a princess named Zelda. Unlike other games of its day, The Legend of Zelda dropped you in the middle of a gigantic world that was open to explore. From an overhead view, you ventured through the fantastical realm of Hyrule, with no direction or guide. This unconventional structure made The Legend of Zelda one of the first free-roaming games ever created. It was up to you to decide where you wanted to go and what you wanted to do. You could journey into dungeons out of order. Some could only be reached with certain items like the raft, or would be extremely difficult to navigate with only 3 hearts and no bow, but it was up to you to make those choices. Luckily, the Nintendo Fun Club newsletter released a map of the overworld. While it outlined the land of Hyrule screen by screen, giving the players a sense of direction, it didn't take away from the sheer size of the game or its difficulty. The Legend of Zelda pioneered an advanced inventory system and introduced the ability to store dozens of different items used to solve puzzles or battle creatures in real time. Zelda was also the first console game to give players the ability to save their progress via battery-backed memory. This feature alone was a clear sign that the game could not be beaten in a couple of hours. It was one of the largest adventures to date, and held that title for some time afterward. After you explored all of Hyrule, found the magic sword, beat all the dungeons, collected the pieces of the Triforce, defeated the evil Ganon, and rescued Princess Zelda, you had basically beaten the game. But the artists behind Nintendo's first RPG went above and beyond, adding a second quest. Instead of requiring you to play the same game twice, it slightly altered the overworld and dungeons to make them even more challenging. Not only did Zelda's gameplay set new standards for the genre, but its music was unlike anything anyone had heard before on the NES. 2 decades later, it's still one of the most recognizable music cues in all of video games. Even other Nintendo titles like Mario and Metroid have lost their inaugural themes over time, but every Zelda adventure ever made has featured this trademark anthem. All of these polished elements came together in a divine synthesis that can only be rivaled by the joining of the almighty Triforce. The original Legend of Zelda has been copied and imitated time and time again, but few have succeeded in making a game of its caliber, or spawning a franchise as emotionally revered. The following year, Nintendo released Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. It's still the only game in the series to drop the Legend of Zelda title, and the only numeric sequel. Zelda 2 was a vastly different experience. It introduced more role-playing elements like experience points, and swapped the overhead view for a side-scrolling perspective. There were no rupees to collect either, which makes it unlike any Zelda game other than Four Swords Adventures. Zelda 2 was extremely difficult, largely due to the fact that you only had 3 lives, and once those were gone, you had to start all the way back at the tomb of the sleeping princess. The action-based platformer was not what a lot of fans were expecting, but then again, no Zelda game ever is. While considered the black sheep of the franchise due to its fundamental differences, Zelda 2 still introduced many groundbreaking elements that have stayed in the series. The Adventure of Link was the first time our young hero used magic, if his brand new magic meter was full, that is. The 8-bit sequel introduced the hammer, which would remain a necessary tool for Link to use against seemingly immovable objects. Zelda 2 also featured a highly advanced combat system, which created more dynamic battles with armed enemies. You had to outmaneuver their shields to land each strike while trying to block their high and low attacks. Even the non-playable characters were presented in a different fashion. Instead of standing still, hiding in a secret cave waiting to be found, they roamed the streets of their individual towns, wandered in and out of their houses, and played a much more important role in Link's adventure. Grand Theft Auto might have shocked the masses when it replenished your health for sleeping with strangers, but Link was apparently getting lucky 13 years earlier. The Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link were two of the most popular games on Nintendo's entertainment system. They solidified Link as one of Nintendo's go-to heroes, and spawned toys, breakfast cereals, and even a televised cartoon.
Well, excuse me, princess.
Be sure to catch part 2 of our Legend of Zelda Retrospective as we take a look at Zelda on the next-gen console, the Super Nintendo, and go handheld on the Game Boy for Link's Awakening. Boomerangs, bombs, dungeons, magic swords, puzzles, and green tunics. Welcome to The Legend of Zelda. After Nintendo had players around the world placing the Japanese 8-bit home entertainment system next to their VHS and cassette players in the mid to late 1980s, a new decade began, and with it, a new era in video games. Nintendo's next-gen contribution to the American market was the Super Nintendo in 1991. The system launched Nintendo's legacy of reinventing their franchises for a new generation, a technological leap that still captivates our imaginations today. The advanced system meant a new free-roaming kingdom of possibilities, and an updated continuation of Link's adventure was at the forefront of every Nintendo fan's mind. 1 year later, in 1992, the gallant sprite set out to destroy all 16 bits of evil in The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. 4 years after the side-scrolling Zelda 2, Nintendo returned the series to an overhead perspective, one that added exquisite detail and a bright polish to the original adventure. The gameplay also seemed gleefully familiar, as you explored the overworld of Hyrule, slashing your way through each grid-locked environment. Your health meter was once again a row of hearts that could now be expanded by finding quarter pieces across the world map. Combining 4 of these would give you another vessel of life, enticing players to explore every nook and cranny in every area to raise their defense. The sequel once again pitted our trusted hero Link against the evil Ganon. Just when you thought you had caught up to him and Zelda was within your grasp, you learned that your eternal nemesis had been sealed away in an alternate dimension known as the Sacred Realm. This parallel universe mirrored Hyrule, but Ganon's evil powers had turned it into a horrible place. Link had to travel back and forth between these two worlds, making the game twice as big as expected, and introducing numerous realm-crossing brain teasers. This mission structure was so successful, it became a major part in several Zelda sequels and other Nintendo franchise releases to follow. Link apparently used his time away from consoles to work out a little bit, because he was much more flexible in the third installment. He could move diagonally, which doubled the directional possibilities, and he could pick up items for moving and throwing. When he was on his guard, he now had the "how did I ever survive without that" ability to attack sideways. Instead of only thrusting his sword forward, Link could stand up against multiple enemies with a move that evolved into a mainstay for future games. A Link to the Past also introduced new items, as fans had come to expect. These included the hook shot for grappling, Pegasus boots for dashing, and the Master Sword, the beloved blade of power that would become the Little Green Warrior's Excalibur. One innovation that added a new level to dungeon exploring, literally, was the addition of an upstairs or downstairs to most of the castles and underground interiors. Link could travel up and down each floor, often finding himself on the same screen twice as he took the high or low road back and forth. He would even fall through floors unexpectedly. This feature not only returned in numerous overhead sequels, but it was an interesting development that would one day become a full 3D experience on the N64. After scaring a few loyal followers with Zelda 2, A Link to the Past was everything they dreamed a true Zelda sequel could be, and more. The bird's eye view returned, letting you view each room, town, forest, and enemy battle in its entirety. The combat was smoother, the environments were bigger, the graphics were prettier, and an arsenal of new items made finding each weapon a triumphant achievement. Needless to say, the game was a smash hit. Adored by fans and critics, A Link to the Past held Nintendo Power's #1 spot on the top games list for over 5 consecutive years. Before Nintendo set to outdo themselves again, they moved the series to their first handheld device, the black and white Game Boy. It was not the first RPG to appear on the Pocket system, but it did give the developers license to move the series into unexpected directions in The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. While sailing back to Hyrule after training abroad, Link was caught in a storm and shipwrecked on Koholint Island. The only way our hero could return home was by snapping the wind fish out of his never-ending slumber. Link's Awakening was the first Zelda game to be set outside of Hyrule, and the main Triforce storyline. Princess Zelda was only mentioned at the beginning, and subsequently stepped out of the spotlight as your primary objective. The on-the-go adventure was the first of the top-view games to feature jumping, a talent Link's cousin Mario had been perfecting for 12 years. This tossed platforming elements into the growing gameplay modes, and added another ability that would become vital when the camera eventually dropped down into the third dimension 5 years later. Link's Awakening was also the first in the franchise that allowed you to assign both buttons to different items, and neither had to be your sword. This opened up new puzzle possibilities like having to dash with the Pegasus boots and jump with Rock's feather. Side quests weren't something that Link hadn't seen before, as there was always much more to do in each Zelda game than you were required to, but the Game Boy exclusive introduced the first trading sequence. This involved meeting several NPCs and traveling to multiple scattered locations to unlock a bonus item, and it continued to beckon true adventurers, itching to find all there was to find on each map in the years and games to follow. Link's Awakening also had an unexpected comedic edge by being surprisingly self-aware. Characters would inform you how to save your game, and then explain that they had no idea what that meant. One character you met introduced himself, and then told you he'd be lost in the forest later on and asked you to keep an eye out for him. To go along with its goofball humor, the Game Boy release featured an uncanny amount of Mario character cameos. From Goombas to Chain Chomps to a Yoshi doll or a picture of Princess Peach, the fourth Zelda title was littered with famous Nintendo faces. And while some fans were shaken by the absence of color in the Zelda universe, the monochrome original returned in a DX version for the Game Boy Color in 1998. Like the console quest before it, Link's Awakening not only introduced new traveling tools that would become indispensable, it inspired future handheld ventures, like the dual cartridge Oracle of Seasons and Ages and the Minish Cap for the Game Boy Advance. It was also the first time Nintendo goers could take Link on the road thanks to the Game Boy's remarkable battery life. Considering how much there was to collect and conquer in each Zelda title, it made it that much more tempting to play when the device was tucked away in your backpack, front pocket, or custom carrying case. We're nearing our halfway point in our journey through the history of Hyrule. Keep your battle camera locked onto Part 3 of our Legend of Zelda Retrospective, as we explore Link's trek into the third dimension on the Nintendo 64. It was there that he starred in what many consider to be the best in the series, and one of the finest video games ever made, the Ocarina of Time, as well as its controversial time-traveling follow-up, Majora's Mask. boomerangs, bombs, dungeons, magic swords, puzzles, and green tunics. Welcome to The Legend of Zelda. While the late 80s and early 90s were quite good to Link, the mid-90s were like Ganon's sacred realm for Zelda fans, empty and miserable. Nintendo was busy developing a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo with Sony, but soon broke the contract to join with Philips. Sony went on to create the PlayStation, and Nintendo eventually dropped the add-on project altogether. However, while partnering with Philips, Nintendo let them borrow the rights to the characters Link, Zelda, and Ganon. Philips went on to create its own CDI console and used its ticket to Hyrule to make 3 Zelda games: Link, The Faces of Evil, Zelda, The Wand of Gamelon, and Zelda's Adventures. Released throughout 1993 and 1994, these games were an absolute joke. Nintendo took no part in developing them, and most fans wish they had never been made. Time slowly crept by for Nintendo fans as they crossed their fingers for Link's true return. It was clear that the industry would have to move into 3D, and everyone's favorite franchise friends would be forced to go with it. This was exciting, but given the unpredictable nature of the Zelda franchise, no one knew what to expect. When the Nintendo 64 was released in 1996, Mario's first appearance in 3D gave gamers a taste of the incredible adventure to come. 2 years later, that quest was dubbed the Ocarina of Time. Pre-ordering the 5th installment in the series guaranteed you a gold-colored cartridge and a chance to experience the future of action role-playing. The moment gamers stepped out onto the main field and saw the sun slowly rise over Hyrule Castle, they knew Link's world would never be the same. While it felt like a completely new gameplay experience at first, longtime fans soon realized it was essentially the same game, but from a thrilling new perspective. All of the 2D elements were there. Hyrule was a massive open world, each town was full of NPCs for shopping and questing, and each dungeon was packed with hidden treasures and dangerous enemies. It was a formula Nintendo had been perfecting for over a decade, and it was an indescribable joy to see it play out in third and first person. Players had to rediscover and relearn the boomerang, the bow, and hookshot, as well as wield the Master Sword with unprecedented precision. Ocarina of Time introduced a revolutionary lock-on targeting system that meant no more aimless bow casting or sword swinging. Your faithful fairy, Navi, guided you through this new mode of combat by telling you where to look and describing things once you selected them. This new way to play became essential when your adventure introduced you to shielded and sword-wielding enemies, as well as several larger-than-life bosses with hidden sweet spots. Your updated arsenal was not complete without a few new entries, like the hidden passage-finding Lens of Truth and the ability to enchant your arrows with fire, ice, or light. Having already made a fashion statement with his signature green getup, Link could now try on a red tunic for fire protection and a blue tunic for breathing underwater. His ensemble could be further customized with boots for sinking into the abyss or gliding on air, a shield for reflecting light sources, and a giant sword that could not be broken. All of these were hidden somewhere in the game. But one of the biggest additions was revealed the moment you booted up Ocarina of Time. In the middle of the world map was Lon Lon Ranch, and trapped within its gates was a trusty companion that would become Link's inseparable pal. After a couple of trips around the track and a triumphant leap over the wall, the horse Epona was yours to ride. She would come when called, leap when able, and free Link up to use his bow and arrow while racing across the open countryside. The most significant enhancement, and one that was pivotal to the core of the storyline, was the ocarina itself. Legendary composer Koji Kondo returned to the Zelda series for the 4th time to score the N64 adventure, composing 10 unique themes that could be manually played by the players themselves. As Link encountered pivotal story characters, they passed down their knowledge in the form of a quick tune you could tap out using the yellow directional buttons. These infectious ditties served as the backbone for the game's brilliant musical score. While these tunes helped Link open doors, turn day into night, and even transport himself across the world map, uncovering the Master Sword led to the game's biggest surprise. After pulling the blade from its resting place, Link was trapped in a dimension that catapulted him right through puberty into adulthood. This plot shift changed everything from the weapons he could use, to the moves he could perform, to the places he could go. But no location he rediscovered in this apocalyptic future was the way he left it. In the time Link was gone, Ganon had cast his evil shadow over the land and tainted all who lived there, similar to his nefarious deeds in A Link to the Past. While Link could eventually travel back to the time he remembered, he would have to face off against an oversized future Ganon to stop him once and for all. While many expected the next Zelda title from Nintendo to exceed everyone's expectations, Ocarina of Time was truly a masterpiece. The graphics might not have been on a PlayStation performance level, and the water temple was absolute torture, but the balance in between all the quests the game had to offer was eternally gratifying. It remains one of the finest achievements in gaming. So how do you top that? Following the endless critical success of the Ocarina of Time, including numerous perfect scores and Game of the Year nods from major gaming publications, Nintendo decided to guide the Zelda series through another sharp turn, one that a lot of fans found unsettling. 2 years later, Nintendo once again took Link out of Hyrule on another doomed vacation, and charged him with saving the time-trapped town of Termina in Majora's Mask. From the very beginning, fans were stripped of everything they had grown to love. Navi was missing, Epona was stolen, even the Ocarina itself was ripped from Link's hands. To make matters worse, the evil Skull Kid turned Link into a Deku scrub, forcing players to get used to the game's biggest development. The sequel was all about masks, and the hidden power some of them possessed to transform Link into one of 3 different creatures: the aforementioned pedal-piloting Deku, a boulder-rolling Goron, and a wave-riding Zora. All of these races appeared in Ocarina of Time and other previous Zelda titles, but this was the first time Link could see through their eyes and use their unique abilities. Some of the dungeons required you to switch back and forth between them on the fly, creating puzzle opportunities even the Zelda Elite had never seen before. Ocarina also featured masks, but you could only carry a few at a time, where Majora had an inventory of 24 slots you filled in as you ventured on. These transformations seem to replace Link's ability to become his older self, a detail some fans sorely missed. While there was no way for Link to travel into the future, he could eventually drop 3 days into the past again and again, a cycle that became Majora's unique method of storytelling. Playing by the clock meant you had a little extra pressure to complete your objectives, because if the cycle was left to finish, Clock Town and the world around it would be destroyed by the evil moon looming over the land. Those that were patient enough to relive the same 3 days over and over began to notice the subtle differences between Majora and Ocarina. While the Hyrule map in Ocarina was larger than the Termina map in Majora, Termina was much more detailed. NPCs weren't glued to the ground or aimlessly running around. They had a schedule, a purpose, and a story to tell if you dug deep enough. After you learned one character's secret, it added a twinge of familiarity when you saw them walking the same path again and again. This also replaced the dimension-swapping gameplay that permeated the other Zelda titles. A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time both featured dueling dimensions that you had to travel between several times. Termina was one big map and one huge world to save. You just had so many days to see it all. While Termina was not Hyrule by any means, it did share certain similarities. It was this fish-out-of-water feeling that made some fans uncomfortable. Lots of loyal Zelda followers were disappointed the sequel strayed so far from the formula, especially after Ocarina of Time had almost perfected it. This is easy to think if you consider Majora's Mask a standalone sequel. As far as the story is concerned, it branches off into very bizarre and dark territory. While the subject matter suggested a more somber tone, the game seemed to be primarily about healing. All of your masked compatriots had their own custom healing song, and your objectives involved curing the land from the conditions that poisoned it. But from a gameplay perspective, the two Nintendo 64 titles complement each other beautifully. One brought the humongous land of Hyrule to life in two eras for the price of one, and the other sought to look closer at the world and the intricate characters living in it. Essentially, each one has what the other one doesn't, and many consider the sequel to be as exceptional as the original. As we travel onward through our tour of Zelda's lineage, we come upon Nintendo's most financially successful console of all time, the Game Boy, which allowed Link to redefine how handheld RPGs were made, with his color adventure too big to fit into one cartridge, the Oracle of Seasons and Ages, and the GameCube and Game Boy Advance multiplayer crossover, Four Swords Adventures. Boomerangs, bombs, dungeons, magic swords, puzzles, and green tunics. Welcome to The Legend of Zelda. While Nintendo has helped pioneer dozens of gaming conventions that still influence the industry today, one of their trademark tactics is to cross their properties across multiple platforms and peripherals. Sometimes, this can lead to some superfluous purchases, but it can also introduce revolutionary ways to make an old formula feel like a completely new experience. After Link made his daring jump into the third dimension with two successful games for the Nintendo 64, Nintendo joined forces with Capcom to continue the fantasy franchise. Just months before they shipped their next home console, the GameCube, Nintendo added a true green to Link's tunic on the newly RGB upgraded Game Boy Color. Under the supervision of Miyamoto, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons were released on the same day in May of 2001. These dual handheld titles were originally going to be a part of the Triforce trilogy, where the two original NES games were to be revamped and included with one completely new game to finish off the acutely symmetrical package. This concept gradually evolved into an all-new trilogy-based project, where each game would represent a third of the Triforce. Unfortunately, it became extremely troublesome to link all three titles, using a brand new password system. Thus, this adventure set was pared down to only two games. Each would be able to stand on its own, but they could also be joined together by using passwords to transfer your progress. From a gameplay perspective, the two games also split the infamous Zelda formula right down the center. Oracle of Ages was primarily puzzle-based for the brain-teasing, labyrinth-exploring crowd, while Oracle of Seasons was more action-oriented for those who favored adventuring with the sword and bow. These quests were unique, but incomplete without the other if you wanted a true Zelda experience. And of course, the true ending to both games. Both the Oracle adventures started the same. On one of Link's frequent visits to the dimension-shifting, glistening gold relic in the Temple of the Triforce, presumably to make sure no one had stolen it again, he was voluntarily pulled into a portal that spit him out in either the world of Labrena or Holodrum. There, he met the Oracles, the singer Nehru or the dancer Din. Just as they introduced themselves to their unexpected guest, the General of Darkness, Onox, or the Sorceress of Shadows, Veron, kidnapped one of these newfound friends and threw their respective worlds off balance. Labrena's flow of time was disrupted, and Link would have to find the 8 essences of time to set it right again. To do this, he could travel 100 years into the past, and then back to the present, changing events and rewriting history as he made each trip back and forth. Holdrum's passage of seasons was adversely affected, and Link was required to wave a magic wand to alter the world between them, allowing him to access different areas. Holdrum's map was bigger than Labrena, but the Ages world was doubled up due to the alternate time periods. Fans could either choose the playstyle they preferred from two technically similar but thematically different journeys to Hyrule and beyond, or combine them for one of the most elaborate quests Link's ever quested. While they may be the two least played games in the franchise, they shared all the elements from their predecessors that make the series continuously impressive. 1 year later, Nintendo ported A Link to the Past to the Game Boy Advance, with a few cosmetic changes. Along with the SNES Classic, the cartridge also featured, for the first time ever, a multiplayer Zelda game, entitled Four Swords. While the game might have been thought of as just a bonus feature, it was a solid Zelda game. However, finding 3 friends with GBA to GBA adapters and copies of the game was another story. Luckily, in 2004, Nintendo released the Four Swords Adventures for the GameCube. The new version allowed one lone gamer to control all 4 little links by snapping them into one of 4 battle formations. The game was much more linear than any Zelda title before it, with no connecting overworld. It was clearly built as a party game or cooperative quest. Similar to how the Oracle twins did a cartridge crossover, Four Swords was designed to transfer data, this time between consoles, via a GameCube to GBA cable. A single player could complete the adventure with just a GameCube controller, but once another player jumped in, everyone needed their own Game Boy Advance to come along. Your perspective would shift from the TV to the handheld in dungeons, caves, houses, and other interiors. Four Swords also marked the return of Dark Link, a doppelganger the good Link faced in Zelda 2 and Ocarina. Had adorable cartoon animation, several head-scratching zone-swapping puzzles, and a top-down perspective with polished lighting, characters, backgrounds, and special effects. Technically, it was the closest thing to a true Link to the Past sequel fans had seen since 1992. While these games might not have been as commercially successful as their gold-plated predecessors, they showcased Nintendo's willingness to try new things and experiment with their technology. Stay tuned as we follow Link's journey back to consoles with a brand new, unexpected look in The Wind Waker, and the penultimate example of Link's handheld prowess, the Minish Cap. Boomerangs, bombs, dungeons, magic swords, puzzles, and green tunics. Welcome to The Legend of Zelda. In August of 2000, at the Space World Expo, Nintendo unveiled the GameCube for the first time. One of the demonstrations being shown was a battle between Ganon and Link, similar in appearance to the old Link and Ganondorf from Ocarina of Time. The brief technical tease lasted barely a minute, but its impact lingered for a full year. Fans could only speculate at what Miyamoto might have in store for the 4th generation of Zelda. Their wildest dreams were way off. The following year, Nintendo introduced gamers to a Link they definitely didn't recognize. It was quite a shock, and a move some longtime denizens of Hyrule felt was entirely in the wrong direction. Making his 10th video game appearance, the new Link was perhaps the youngest version of the adolescent hero that had ever been created. Miyamoto defended the decision to make a Zelda game for all ages, and redesigned the land of Hyrule to look like an interactive cartoon. From the sequel's first impressions, a lot of critics and gamers expressed serious doubts, especially since Sony was about to release the PlayStation 2, and Microsoft was well on their way to creating their first home console. Most of those reservations were put to rest when The Wind Waker was released in March of 2003. The ironic thing about the new art design was that it was initially criticized as failing to give the Zelda series the next-gen detail and expression they felt it deserved, when the Link in Wind Waker is arguably one of the most expressive video game heroes ever conceived. From his subtle eye movements to his jubilant exultations, he's also one of the cutest characters as well. To this day, few games have achieved this caliber of cel-shaded animation. The story took place hundreds of years after the Ocarina of Time. Hyrule now lay at the bottom of a deep ocean called the Great Sea. Legends of a boy in a green tunic, a buried gold relic, and an unnamed evil were passed down across the ages, vaguely explaining how the ancient land had been covered in water. To help instill the courage of the hero of time in their children, and continue their dream of his inevitable return, parents dressed their kids in green garb when they were old enough to begin their own adventures. Once Link got his emerald cloak and cap, he spotted his first damsel in distress, a pirate captain named Tetra. After the Helmarok King dropped her into the forest, Link discovered Tetra and her salty crew. But upon returning to the village, the giant bird reappeared and kidnapped Link's sister, Errol. With no choice but to travel to the Forsaken Fortress and rescue her, Link boarded Tetra's ship, set sail on the open ocean, and said goodbye to his home. The following breaking and entering sequence was the first time Link was forced to use stealth. You were always free to evade or avoid certain enemies, but this stony searchlight-smothered stronghold turned Link into Solid Snake, with tights. He could pick up barrels and wear them as he tiptoed around, a strategy that was available to you throughout the rest of the game. After the rescue attempt went awry, Link was tossed out to sea and left for dead. Thankfully, he was saved by the King of Red Lions, a one-man sailing ship that gave plenty of wisdom and encouragement to the aspiring adventurer. Once you ran into town and picked up a sail, you could set out to rediscover Hyrule once again, even if most of it was hidden beneath the surface. On the way to Dragon Roost Island, players soon realized the unexpected power of producing environments so boldly beautiful, but technically simplified. It meant that unless you were visiting a major island for the first time, or entering a cave or dungeon, there were no loading times to break up the exploration, and draw distances that had to be seen to be believed. Cruising from one island to another was an astonishingly seamless experience, and the vast ocean was not only the biggest Hyrule ever produced, but one of the largest open game worlds players have had the privilege to explore. Unfortunately, the Red Lion was not a motorboat. With no self-propulsion, Link was completely reliant on the way of the winds. He had to go where they were going, and to swing the directional draft in his favor, he had to learn a brand new instrument. With the titular Wind Waker, Link could command the skies like he was conducting a symphony orchestra. The sheet music layout was similar to the Ocarina's playlist, but you could now change the tempo. The first leg of the Seafaring Quest charged Link with recovering 3 pearls. He then transported them to the Triangle Islands, revived the Tower of the Gods, and defeated the boss Godan to prove his worth. This revealed a beam of light that warped Link and the Red Lion King miles beneath sea level to the frozen ruins of Hyrule. Trapped in time, the castle was the final resting place of the Master Sword, and the palace, along with all the enemies within it, sprang to life once Link took the blade into his hands. With his familiar weapon, Link could now perfect Wind Waker's additions to the tried and true 3D combat system. You could still lock on and strafe around targets with ease, but the larger shielded characters would give off a signal when they were preparing to launch a heavy attack. When this happened, players could parry that advance, dashing around the enemy and attacking from behind. This gave you one more way to save your skin, and was necessary to free some of the larger characters of their armor. After fighting his way back to the surface, Link soon realized that Ganon still lived. Tetra was actually Princess Zelda, and the King of Red Lions was really the King of Hyrule, who hadn't appeared in a Zelda title since A Link to the Past. He helped Zelda form her Golden Wisdom Piece, informed Link of Ganon's villainous but predictable plan to steal the Triforce, and tasked the young lad from Outset Island to restore power to the depleted Master Sword, unravel 8 nautical charts, slowly revealing the location of the Triforce of Courage, and face Ganon once again. Upon giving Ganon another splitting headache, Hyrule finally succumbed to the pressure of the Great Sea. As Link and Zelda ascended to the surface, the King, Ganon, and the kingdom players had explored for almost 20 years disappeared beneath a torrential tidal wave. These events lead directly into the upcoming Phantom Hourglass for the Nintendo DS. Those who persisted through Link's first GameCube adventure had to stop at least once and marvel at its magnificence. Despite its relatively tame difficulty level, the sheer size of the world and the quest was enough to make the most dedicated fan sigh with exhaustion. The Wind Waker proved that each Zelda adventure will be far from what you expect, while showcasing hours of careful design and years of technical experience. After the Wind Waker, the Nintendo faithful knew they would have to wait a while for the next epic console journey through Hyrule, or wherever Link would find himself next. This time of darkness created another opportunity to release a handheld excursion into uncharted territory. Handheld technology is usually a generation or two behind the consoles, so the Game Boy Advance was able to generate environments similar to the Super Nintendo. Adding several layers of depth to the detailed sprite design from A Link to the Past, the Minish Cap was released in the beginning of 2005. Every 100 years, the Picori, or the Minish as they like to call themselves, return to Hyrule and grant humans with magical gifts to commemorate the time when they saved the kingdom from imminent destruction. A Picori festival is held to celebrate their arrival, along with a sword fighting competition. But when the victor Vaati receives his prize, the Picori sword, he destroys it and turns Princess Zelda into stone. The king and his royal counselor turn to Link, son of the local blacksmith, to bring her back to life. Like all the other portable Zelda journeys, the Minish Cap showed gamers a side of Link's hometown they had never seen before. Your perspective allowed you to look underneath the surface of Hyrule and discover each Minish environment. This miniature race was widely thought to be a fairy tale, but Link could witness the proof of their existence firsthand by shrinking himself at one of several Minish altars. The crafty little critters loved to hide things under objects, which explained why Link's been known to find random treasures underneath rocks or patches of green grass in each game. Near the beginning of the quest, Link was introduced to Ezlo, a bird-like creature closely resembling Link's green cap. Ezlo helped reduce Link's stature so that he could head out on his mission of microscopic proportions. The trials ahead included collecting and assembling multicolored kinstones, and discovering the 4 quarters of the broken Picori sword to restore it to full 4-sword strength. Ezlo eventually revealed that he was Vaati's mentor, and they were both once Minish. Vaati stole one of Ezlo's wish-granting caps, transforming himself into a mighty sorcerer. He then morphed Ezlo into his current state and became drunk with power. Link's fight to save the Light Force led him through the tiniest cracks and biggest dungeons in Hyrule, through an Alice in Wonderland tale that only the action RPG wizards at Nintendo could realize. Vaati was eventually destroyed, Hyrule was saved, and the doorway to the Minish world was closed. This ended the last Link adventure ever created. No Zelda title has been released in almost 2 years. Join us next week for a complete tour through the lineage of The Legend of Zelda, and the conclusion to our 6-part retrospective. In the final installment, we'll follow each game chronologically through the history of Hyrule, shedding light on the hidden connections between each title, and taking in one of the most successful video game series of all time, from start to finish. Boomerangs, bombs, dungeons, magic swords, puzzles, and green tunics. Welcome to The Legend of Zelda. Warning: when discussing the history of Hyrule, very little can be considered absolute. Nintendo has yet to release an actual timeline of the events that take place within each Zelda title and how they connect. The following segment is our theory of how each game fits into Nintendo's grand scheme, if there even is one. We're not saying that this is the absolute answer, but our findings will hopefully open up a few ideas about Hyrule's past you may have never thought of before. Hyrule was created by 3 goddesses, Din, Nehru, and Foror. Once they created the fantasy world, they left it. All that remained in their wake was the Triforce, and the void that was created in the spot where they crossed dimensions. This became known as the Sacred Realm, or Golden Land to the inhabitants of Hyrule. All of this is told during a cutscene that plays partway through the Ocarina of Time. Several sages emerged out of the Hylian people. They constructed numerous temples, including the Temple of Time, and the Master Sword to protect the Triforce and the Sacred Realm. Before long, a war began amongst the races of Hyrule to find the Triforce, and it lasted for several ages. Eventually, the Minish grew sick of the never-ending conflict and created the Picori sword. This weapon was given to Gustav, a soldier garbed in green, who used it to stop the Long War. Gustav was dubbed King of Hyrule, and the Picori sword, or 4-sword, was placed in a pedestal. Every 100 years, a swordsmanship tournament would be held, and the winner would be permitted to touch the legendary blade. Most of this information was first revealed in the Minish cap for the Game Boy Advance. A number of theories, including our own, consider Minish Cap to be the earliest game in the timeline. A couple of notions from the game itself support this. The opening speaks of the Pickery giving their sword to the hero of men, not the hero of time. This turns out to be Gustav, who wore a green tunic but no hat. Our Link at the beginning of the story wears green but is hatless as well. Eslo, the malformed mage who catches a ride on Link's head throughout the adventure, crowns the lad with his own green cap once the wizard returns to his original form. Eslo says it suits Link, and the emerald cap would go on to become a staple of the heroes of Hyrule. The second game, which is similarly placed throughout multiple fan-created backstories, is the Ocarina of Time. It seems to feature the first appearance of Ganondorf, as the King of Hyrule doesn't seem to know about his evil intentions. Ganondorf was busy searching for the entrance to the Sacred Realm so that he could wield the power of the Triforce and rule Hyrule. But after years of finding nothing, he decided to trick the king into helping him. Every other Zelda title, except for Minish Cap and Majora's Mask, has mentioned Ganon in some way, shape, or form. If these adventures are chronological, Ocarina would have to be second in line. In 1998, Miyamoto also stated that the Ocarina of Time is the first story. This was about 6 years before the Minish Cap was released. After Ocarina, however, things get a little foggy. Majora's Mask obviously follows it, but after that, we've seen a surprising amount of variation. Some ideas end with the Wind Waker, and some with the original 8-bit games. The one we found to be the most compelling and confusing is the split timeline theory. It begins to drastically shift the legend directly after Ocarina of Time. The theory argues that 2 different Hyrules were created at the end of that game. You defeat Ganon as adult Link, and speak with adult Zelda afterwards. She wishes for Link to have a childhood, so she uses the Ocarina to send him back to before they met. This becomes Hyrule A, with Link and Zelda as children, before Ganon took over. Hyrule B is the world he left behind, where adult Zelda remained after Ganon had been defeated, and Link had been deleted. Meanwhile, in the past, young Link and young Zelda inform the king of Ganon's evil plans. Link then leaves Hyrule before the war breaks out, in search of Navi, who left him in the Temple of Time. This brings Link to Majora's Mask. After he saves Termina, Link attempts to return to Hyrule via the sea, but is shipwrecked, and begins the Game Boy adventure, Link's Awakening. Link's Awakening is rumored to be a dream. As it comes to a close, Link regains consciousness in the ocean, and the island has mysteriously disappeared. At the end, he battles a nightmare creature that takes the shape of Ganon. This reveals to him his deepest fear, inevitable future, or both. Link made his way back to Hyrule to discover that Ganon had won the war. Stripped of his equipment after being shipwrecked, Link had to collect his armor and weapons and stop Ganon a second time. This began the original Legend of Zelda for the NES. In Link's absence, the citizens of Hyrule moved north, which explains why the early overworld map didn't have any towns or castles. Ganon had eventually uncovered the Triforce of Power, and Zelda received the Triforce of Wisdom. Fearing Ganon would take her piece of the ancient relic, Zelda broke it into 8 pieces. Link eventually picked them all back up, destroyed Ganon, and became a hero once again. According to its manual, Zelda 2 takes place several seasons after Zelda 1. The sequel introduces Link to the actual Legend of Zelda, a tale many gamers have never heard before. A long time ago, the King of Hyrule's son learned about the Triforce and desired it greatly. An evil wizard informed the prince that his younger sister Zelda knew of its whereabouts. The two confronted Zelda, but when the princess refused to talk, the wizard forced her into a deep sleep. Overcome with power, the wizard died in the process, leaving the prince guilt-stricken over betraying his own blood. He had his sister moved to the North Castle altar and declared that every daughter born into the royal family shall be named Zelda. This event predates the Minish Cap, but occurs after the events of King Gustav. This clears up a bit of the confusion gamers feel when they keep encountering characters with the same name. Link learned all of this when he headed north to rediscover Hyrule in Zelda 2. The princess trapped in a deep sleep was none other than the original Zelda, placed there by her brother years before. Link hunted for the Triforce of Courage, prevented the return of Ganon, and pulled this original Princess Zelda from her eternal slumber. Soon after Zelda 2 is the Four Swords adventure, with either a new Link and Zelda, or the same duo that first met during the Ocarina of Time. It's clear the multiplayer journey takes place after the Minish Cap, because it begins with the villainous Vaati trapped within the Pickery Sword. But it definitely took place before A Link to the Past, because once he's revealed as Vaati's puppet master, Ganon acquires the Trident of Power, which he then uses on the Super Nintendo. A Link to the Past speaks of an evil that had been sealed away by the sages, which would lead one to assume that the Super Nintendo quest takes place during Hyrule B, the timeline that began once the sages had sealed the evil, and Zelda had been left behind in a world with a sealed Ganon and no Link. But one could also assume that young Link told the king of his adventure after he traveled back in time. This tale would have ended with Ganon being destroyed, and could have been passed down as a legend and not a historical account, despite Ganon eventually winning the war. In issue 165 of Nintendo Power, Eiji Onuma, who was the assistant director on Ocarina and directed Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Phantom Hourglass, said, "If you think back to the end of Ocarina of Time, there were two endings in that game in different time periods. First, Link defeated Ganon as an adult, and then he actually went back to being a child. You could say that the Wind Waker takes place 100 years after the ending in which Link was an adult. So the story that's retold at the beginning of Wind Waker explains what happened to Zelda and Hyrule after Link disappeared in time. Ganon found a way to escape his prison and still possessed the Triforce of Power. Zelda's descendant, Tetra, still carried the Triforce of Wisdom, but the new Link was forced to rediscover the Triforce of Courage." Let's take a broad look at the picture we're attempting to paint. Minish Cap first, Ocarina second, then the timeline splits. There's Hyrule A, with Link and Zelda as kids warning the king of Ganon's evil plans, and parallel to that, Hyrule B, with a sealed-away Ganon, adult Zelda, and no Link. Hyrule A leads to Majora's Mask, Link's Awakening, Zelda 1, Zelda 2, Four Swords, and then A Link to the Past. Hyrule B leads to Wind Waker. But we're missing two games, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. These titles lend themselves to this split timeline theory best of all. They were released on the same day and begin pretty much the same way. Link goes to check on the Triforce via different routes, however. The theory speculates that these games are taking place at the exact same time, just in two different Hyrules. Both games begin with the Triforce in its resting place. The previous games for both timelines have presumably reset the Triforce. Both Ages and Seasons deal with someone trying to resurrect Ganon. Does this solidify the split timeline theory? We're going to leave that up to you to decide. We're not sure which Game Boy Color adventure takes place in which timeline, but we've speculated that both games occur at the end of each, or at least the end of the story that's been told so far. That was fun, but we also have two brand new Zelda games coming out that could totally shatter this and all other theories. What we do know is that Phantom Hourglass takes place after Wind Waker. As long as the game doesn't resurrect Ganon or disturb the Triforce, it fits in this timeline with no problem, and we can't wait to get our hands on it. The real question is, where does Twilight Princess fit? And will it connect any of these dots? Apparently, it takes place between Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker, which would set it in Hyrule B. We have yet to play through the entire game, so plenty of questions still remain. It seems that a strange darkness is trying to consume Hyrule and Zelda. Could this darkness be trying to destroy the princess due to the split she caused by returning Link to his childhood? Or is it just Ganon trying to make his evil return? Will Hyrule ultimately be flooded in the end, giving birth to Wind Waker's Great Sea? The ending of Twilight Princess could dramatically disprove all of these ideas, but we were eager to collect them and assemble our theory of how Hyrule happened, especially after looking back at this groundbreaking franchise. Thanks for joining us on our 6-part retrospective on The Legend of Zelda. We look forward to discussing and debating multiple timelines and dimensions as Nintendo continues one of the greatest fantasy adventures of all time. long as there's a Triforce, there will be a Zelda. As long as there's a prosperous kingdom, there will be an evil bent on destroying it. And as long as there's an oppressive force threatening Hyrule, there will be a boy in a green tunic, silver shield, and magic blade to stand against it.